Today on a special Marvel TV Weekly, I'm joined for the whole show by the great Chris Claremont, best known for his legendary 17-year run on Uncanny X-Men, among others. But today we're primarily discussing Carol Danvers, who the world now knows as Captain Marvel. Marvel TV Weekly starts now!
You're tuned in to AfterBuzz TV, the ESPN of TV talk. Now, let the buzz begin.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to, as I said, a very special Marvel TV Weekly, a Tuesday afternoon Marvel TV Weekly. As I said in the intro, joined for the entire show by the great Chris Claremont. And I've talked to him a few times over the years about, predominantly about Uncanny X-Men. But as I said, I'd really like to spend some time talking about Carol Danvers because there's so much new interest in her. Chris, first of all, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, so since we're starting with Carol, I wanted to start off and get some of your thoughts on her big screen debut in Captain Marvel.
I thought it was a lot of fun. I think Brie Larson looked great. I'm curious to see what happens next. Since referring to the after credits sequence.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I saw you had some interesting thoughts that you shared on Facebook after you saw it, which was it presented a lot of questions for you. And I was like, oh, yeah. So she's this, supremely powerful being. And it's not a secret that Thanos is trying to collect these Infinity Stones. So even if, okay, she's really busy trying to find the Skrulls of Homeworld, somebody ought to say, hey, you might want to look at this guy, Thanos. Was that the gist of what you were wondering? Or did I simplify it too much?
I think part of the questions revolve around the fact it's been a quarter century. She apparently has a resistance to traditional aging. I don't know how long it took her to find the Skrulls a Homeworld, or how much opposition she had to deal with along the way. Whether she moved faster than light, the Skrulls don't, or vice versa. It just left the same kind of curiosity one might find reading a really good intro setup issue of a comic.
Yeah, I think it is it's been a little while since we've had one of those introductory films. I mean, because Black Panther we got to meet in Civil War, so we already had a little familiarity. So, and yeah, the conceit of it being in the '90s, I guess that's part of their bigger plan. So, apart from I guess picking some fun '90s pop tunes, I'm not quite sure why it had to be then, but I thought, like you said, I thought it was really fun. And I wanted to speak to you a little bit about the Kree-Skrull War. Now, Roy Thomas, who is responsible for creating Carol while he was writing Captain Marvel, he didn't really like this idea. Were you surprised by the twist that, hey, these Skrulls are actually not so bad? And what did you think of it, considering what the way that we've known the Skrulls from comics for so many years?
Well, I basically consider film reality totally different from comics reality. Whatever Kevin Feige had in mind for as a concept and an execution for Captain Marvel, the film, pulled from a lot of comic book sources in terms of her appearance, in terms of the natures of her power, in terms of her origin. You could have a whole hour on just disputations about what was taken, what was left behind, what was used, what was not used. That's a decision every producer makes when he or she comes to bringing an adapted story to the screen. I think the only real times you'll get a huge measure of solidarity to the written work is when you're J.K. Rowling or George R.R. Martin, and you actually have active, ongoing control of the film product. In this case, it's Kevin's product, his project, his basic creation, and he's pulling, or the direct writing and directing team on Captain Marvel were pulling from her entire history. So some things came into the film from Captain Marvel, some things came into the film from Ms. Marvel, some things came into the film from the X-Men via binary. You just do it.
Yeah, I thought that the power levels that she had were, to me at least, more reminiscent of binary than certainly Ms. Marvel. You know, who obviously had cosmic powers, but it wasn't the level of I'm going to take out an entire Kree battalion of warheads.
Well, I never really thought of Ms. Marvel as having cosmic powers. I just thought she was an extremely tough and capable superhero who could stand with the Avengers.
Sure.
But that led to a series of stories that I did that had nothing, that were the antithesis of what we saw on screen.
Yeah. Speaking of the difference between film reality and comic reality, do you feel like it in any way did a disservice to the Marvel character? Not that he was played by a wonderful actress like Annette Bening, but instead that it just happens to be a scientist and not this, costume superhero like we are familiar with the character. To me, I was just like, well, it could have kind of been anybody.
Well, you have to go back to the original concept, and it being, I guess, the 60s, Marvel was a guy. That's the fundamental starting point. No, I mean, you adapt to a new reality. I mean, to be quite honest, no supreme intelligence that I ever worked with had an artist draw and I wrote ever looked like Annette Bening. So, the times they are changing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the supreme intelligence just always sort of the big green giant face on a screen. I think.
Also, forgive me for interrupting. Not even a human face, humanoid perhaps, but not human.
No.
So,
yeah.
Again, you adapt, basically covering it by the justification that's used in the film. I adapt my visual persona to the person I'm talking to. So, Carol has one vision, but what's his face from Dr. Watson? Jude.
Oh, Jude Law. Yes.
Yeah, has a totally different one, which he describes, but you don't see.
Yes.
So they covered that, I think, quite appropriately for the film. But again, you're dealing with transferring material from one medium to another and from one era to another. Bear in mind, the Ms. Marvel stories we're referring to date from, God help us, the 80s, the early 80s. So we're talking 35 years. The world, the filmmaking world, the social world, the perceptive world has changed remarkably and markedly in those 35 plus years. Had this film been made in 1990 or even 2000, it would have been a totally different, I suspect, a totally different approach to the storytelling and the characterization. I saw actually one newspaper article that was contrasting the presentation of Ms. Marvel today with Jane Fonda doing Barbarella back in the day. And so it's, the times change, the people change, the films change to fit the society that they're reaching out to. Again, to use another paradigm, the Wonder Woman and the Paradise Island we saw in Wonder Woman is nothing like what one could imagine back in the TV series days.
Sure. Yeah, for me, one of the nice little surprises for the film was the inclusion of a young Monica Rambeau, who, for me, that was Captain Marvel when I was reading. So I thought it was sort of a fun little Easter egg with the idea of like, yeah, we're going to be 20 years in the future, so we'll probably see her. Did you think that was a nice touch?
Well, the challenge I have is that Monica Rambeau came along long after I had left. And I mean, my connection with Carol Danvers pretty much ceased, back in '91 when I left the first time. I was more intrigued from a gotcha standpoint by the remarkably vital and really cool Nick Fury.
Yes.
You know, I mean, the only time one saw any evidence that the Nick Fury on screen was far younger and more vital than the Nick Fury we're used to seeing in Avengers was when he and Carol were running down the hall, and you suddenly thought, okay, that's perhaps not the way that Samuel Jackson would have done it, you know, back in the Pulp Fiction age. But the thing I liked, I was incredibly impressed by, was what seemed to be so much fun he was having with the character.
Yeah, as great as it was to, you know, watch her blow stuff up and, you know, the fight scenes and all that, just from a legitimate enjoyment standpoint, the scenes of them just driving around in the car, I'm like, this is what I like most about the movie. That was the most fun for me. You know, if they,
character.
Yeah, right, exactly. I thought that was great character work. If you know, they just went on a road trip and didn't even run into any Skrulls, I probably would have still liked that. Maybe not quite as much.
Well, the other gotcha moment that I appreciated was the fact that Fury got the idea for his initiative from the tag name on her aircraft.
Yeah, I thought that was nice, and I like the explanation of his eye, which you know is, you know, like anything, it's a very divisive topic on the internet. But I thought it's funny, you know, and of course he's not going to tell anybody what really happened. So, yeah, I think that it did a good job of introducing this character, and yes, we'll see how she plays well with others in Endgame, based on the little scene that we saw in the mid credits, and there's a very brief instant of her in the latest Endgame trailer. So we don't have long to wait for all that.
Well, I find my one quibble with all of that was the shot of her in the Endgame in the Endgame tag with Thor. It was like, how much time has passed since she first shows up and says, "Where's Nick Fury?"
Right.
And her showing up to meet Thor. I think I prefer her 1990 hairstyle to, I guess this is the 2020 hairstyle.
Yes, I think you're right.
Before she looked kind of spunky and cool and kick-ass, and now to I assume, jaded, mature eye, it wasn't as much fun seeing her with Thor. It was like, okay, she's a grown-up, but I liked her better as a kick-ass fighter jock. Or yeah. I guess jock isn't the accurate nomenclature anymore, but there you go.
No, yeah, but I don't know. I think in this day and age, jock is not a gender-specific term anymore, you know?
Well, that's a good cover. I don't know how many people will buy it, but there you go.
That's all right. So, you know, one of the main reasons why I had the thought to see if you'd be interested in talking about Carol is because just for me, for a long time, you know, I saw you, you know, reading these comics a little bit after they were published, I saw you as somebody who looked out for Carol Danvers at a point where I don't think she was treated very well. And we'll talk in a little bit about Avengers Annual number 10, but I'm kind of interested in how you ended up writing the Ms. Marvel solo book after just a couple issues Jerry Conway started. And by my account, you were doing at least Iron Fist, Marvel Team Up, and of course Uncanny X-Men, and I'm sure I'm missing something. So you had a lot of plates in the air, you know, like the old plate spinners on Ed Sullivan.
Well, bluntly, there were no after publication payments of any kind. What you got was based on your page rate, and in those days my page rate wasn't that great. So you basically earned your living by grabbing as many titles as were possible. And in my case, it seemed like a cool character, and when Jerry gave up the book, I was in the right place at the right time. And the weird thing about it was, over the 15 or so issues that we lasted after that, it turned into, how can we make this better as a printed project as much as how can we do really cool stories? And that eventually evolved into Dave Cockrum coming in and redesigning the initial costume so she would look unique, visually unique, and utterly cool, which, again, by the standards of the late 70s, early 80s, she did. The problem for me was that Jim Starlin, in designing that Captain Marvel costume, for the male Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel,
Sure.
it was a brilliant piece of character design. I mean, you looked at the way Jim drew the physical form of Marvel, and then you looked at the way he costumed it, and it was a paradigm. It just totally accentuated all the proper elements of idealized male physiognomy. I mean, broad shoulders, narrow hips, and this brilliant isosceles triangle straight down to the crotch, for better or worse. And it all worked. The problem is when you take that same design as they did and plaster it on Carol, the female physiognomy doesn't work like that. You know, it's a nice arrow down to the waist, and then suddenly the body takes a U-turn and heads out. And so what we ended up with, in terms of Carol, to my eye anyway, was a color swath across the shoulders that instantly slammed everybody's eyes to her chest, and then a bikini bottom at the other end that basically emphasized her hips. So there was no ideal, comfortable way of looking at her. And then she had these two, you know, bare stomach, bare back, and these two connecting bands down her side, which might have seemed appropriate in concept, but turned out to be absolute hell to draw. I mean, if one were a John Buscema, one could find a way to do it, but most of the artists who worked on Carol over the subsequent issues weren't. And we were always in a situation where, in one example, we tell an artist she has to look more, for want of a better term, sexy. But his vision of sexy derived from the 1950s and early 60s. So we would have shots where she looked like something straight out of not even Playboy.
Right.
And it just was entirely inappropriate for what we were trying to do with the character. You know, Carmine Infantino did it brilliantly towards the end of the run, and then Dave came in and knocked it out of the ballpark. But it's a matter of finding, again, it's looking at Peter Parker as Spider-Man, and you can't get better than that. It epitomizes all the elements one would look for in a superhero who is related to spiders and a kid, and it grew with him, but it was just it was then and is now the ideal costume for that character. And our Dave's and my goal through our working together, both directly on Ms. Marvel, but then just coming to him and say, have you got any great visual ideas, was to give her something as equally iconic, something, and better yet, something that was totally primally unique to her. You couldn't look at it and say, well, like, she used to be Captain Marvel, or she used to be connected with Captain Marvel, which is why Dave and I eventually brought her to binary in the X-Men, because it was my way as a writer of divorcing her from all the baggage, in a sense, that had followed her ever since her first appearance as head of security at Cape Canaveral, or Cape Kennedy, rather. It made her unique, both visually unique, conceptually unique. It gave her what she wanted as a character, which is the ability to fly in space better than anyone, and she looked really cool. I mean, the thing with Carol, what everyone sort of skips as they look through the canon, is it's specifically stated in the first issue. She's security chief of Cape Kennedy, or the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. This is not a minor league job. And she had a history in Air Force intelligence. So one has to figure, okay, she's identified as a major when she first came in. That's not a kid. We're talking about someone in their 30s. So how you present them to the audience has to be factored, at least in my head, through that prism. She's a person of maturity in her craft and also in her actual age. She's not going to run around in, in hip huggers,
Right.
or at least the grown-up hip huggers and not teenage hip huggers. She won't react to things the way Peter Parker did when he was in high school. And the look of the character and the kind of ways we approach the story have to reflect that.
Yeah, I always found that the visual of the original design, obviously she's identified as Ms. Marvel because that was a very empowering term in the 70s. And, obviously it stands out, I guess, on the rack. But then, the fact that it was such a skimpy version of Marvel's costume, I think that they did a better job. Whoever designed the Jessica Drew Spider-Woman costume, she didn't really look like Spider-Man. She certainly looked like a spider character, but it was not like, we're going to take Spider-Man's costume and change it just a little bit.
Yeah,
so go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. Forgive me for interrupting. Yes, that worked. And worked really well.
And so the redesigned costume that Dave Cockrum did, I think, is great, and you'll still see it at, maybe you see it at conventions. People will cosplay that costume. I know that there's a current Ms. Marvel character, Kamala Khan, and her costume is very similar to that one. But I think people just always gravitated towards that costume, and yeah, it is a lot more practical for fighting and yes, being in space or anything really than the original one. So her book ends very abruptly, and I think fans of the character might have initially been excited at the idea of like, well, she's going to be in the Avengers now. But for me, she never really meshed well with the Avengers. I felt like there were issues where she was involved in fight scenes but didn't have any dialogue, and you wonder, do they remember she's on the team? And that's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it felt that way to me when I was reading some of these. Whereas like a character like She-Hulk, I felt fit in well in both the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. Do you have a feeling why Carol might not have fit in with the Avengers, and maybe it's just the Avengers at that time?
Well, I think that's a question you have to direct to the writer of the Avengers. I mean, David Michelinie or whomever else was working on it. I don't know. My one contribution to that to that timeline was a primal response to a primal provocation. But beyond that, I mean, I gathered after that was done, I gathered her into the X-Men because no one else wanted to use her or was willing to use her, and I didn't want to see the good work of Annual 10 go to waste, or what I considered go to waste. So I hauled her into the X-Canon. But in terms of how she's handled in the Avengers, both before 200 and Annual 10 and after, when she returned, I guess, as something or other.
Warbird, yeah. That's a little after my time, but yeah.
Too. And Captain Marvel, or Ms. Marvel, sorry.
Yes.
That's something to go to, I guess, Tom Revort or the specific writers on the series.
Yeah. Well, you alluded to it, and I want to explain for our audience that maybe isn't as particularly up to speed on this. The way Carol was written out of the book in Avengers number 200,
Sorry.
It sounds like a tea kettle. But the way that Carol was written out of the book in Avengers 200, to me, can only be characterized as a travesty. And there's a well-known piece that Carol Strickland wrote at the time, was accurately called The Rape of Ms. Marvel. And just to give the sort of quick summary for people watching, the Avengers essentially let Carol go off with this guy named Marcus, who says he's Immortus' son. He specifically stated he used some of his father's machinery to make her fall in love with him. But everybody's like, okay, well, have fun. Nice knowing you, Carol. And
well, you really have to go back to the very beginning, which is that Carol wakes up one morning and discovers she's 3 months pregnant.
Correct, yeah.
And everyone's going, oh, that's lovely. Who's the father? What are you talking about? I went to bed normal.
Yeah, right,
and then they realize something's up when the pregnancy increases exponentially over the next 48, 72 hours, and then within 3 or 4 days, she gives birth to, I guess,
Marcus is the character's name.
Marcus, who in turn grows to adulthood in a matter of days.
Yes.
And announces that, well, I'm a being from another dimension, yada, yada. I came to plight my troth to Carol, and everyone takes it at face value, including Carol. And in the end, they wish them all Godspeed, have a lovely life. You're happily, you're going off with the man you love. See you later. And off she goes.
Yeah, and it's not just, the fellas are like, oh, hey, good for, Janet, the Wasp, and Wanda, the Scarlet Witch, they're there too. And they're like, hey, this is great for you. I think that everyone, it's not just the male characters that, handle it poorly. And so that inspires Avengers Annual number 10. In terms of Avengers 200, obviously you didn't write that book.
No.
And no one seems to want to take credit for actually writing that book. And I know this is like 40 years ago. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because Jim Shooter very specifically says he didn't write it. He says he'll take the blame. But in 2011, he said, ask David Michelini or you. And I don't understand why one would ask you, because you were not a writer on the Avengers.
I think from what David has said at conventions, that was a book with an issue that involved a lot of disputation between writer and editor and editor-in-chief, that David was not happy with it. It was one of those things where I suspect it's issue 200. We have to have a major event. It seemed like a great idea perhaps when they started, but the deeper it got into the story, the more unresolvable conflicts came to life. But the problem was George had to start drawing it. George Perez had to start drawing it, and they ran into the deadline. And sometimes stories that you wish had been issue 217 and could be forgotten a month later,
sure,
turned into issue 200, and you've got to live with it. The problem, I think, from Marvel's perspective is another writer who was considered himself, well, we won't go into that, but the other writer's head exploded, and he wanted the opportunity to, for want of a better term, set things right. And Jim, to his credit, let me go with that. Tom, to his credit, accepted the story that I turned in, and I had, to my credit, I got the chance to work for 34 plus pages with Michael Golden.
Right.
The joke of the story, if you can consider anything a joke, is the first 28 pages where you've got the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which is an incredibly stupid name in and of itself.
But that's a Stan and Jack term, so even by 1980 you still had to use it. Yeah.
But you had Mystique, and this is the introduction of Rogue,
right?
Basically kicking the Avengers' ass up, down, and sideways for a bunch of pages until the Avengers figured out how to win. That's the prologue. The actual story, as Jim Shooter gleefully says every so often, doesn't begin until page 38, where you have the X-Men mansion as the Quinjet lands and Carol waiting for her confrontation with her friends. And Michael did breathtakingly good art, character art, for that handful of pages. And for me, that's the whole story right there. It's Carol going up to people she thought were her friends and her teammates. And bear in mind, she's Air Force. Your team, your squadron, your wing person, those are the people you depend on for your life. You don't let them down. They don't let you down. To put it in film terms, Monica Rambeau's mom was her wingman, wing person.
Sure, yeah.
They covered each other's back. Even that's one of the things when Carol comes back in the middle of the film and she meets what was her mom's name?
Maria.
Maria. When
Yeah.
she meets Maria Rambeau, it's like Maria's like, what happened? We looked all over. We and Carol's going, I don't remember you. And it's really a nice emotional punch moment of the story, because you've got these two people who are buds in the best sense of the term. They depend on each other for their lives as pilots, as test pilots, as what one could think looking ahead 5 or 8 years, fighter pilots. And that got run over. The concept got run over. And in that sense, Carol had the same relationship ideally with the rest of the Avengers, and nobody covered her back. And this is her calling them on it. And from my perspective, leaving them at the point where they had to deal with that. And while, for someone like Captain Marvel, that's a reality that matters. He went through war. He had people watching his back fighting when he was fighting, well, first the Nazis, then Hydra. They depended on him. He depended on them. The heartbreak of the comic Captain America, is he couldn't save Bucky.
Yeah.
Bucky died. These are relevant characterizational moments that I thought needed to be presented. The heroes needed to be called on it as a learning process, I guess. But it's something I hoped that the readers could relate to as well.
Knowing that I was going to talk to you today, I actually reread Avengers Annual number 10 yesterday for the first time in years. I couldn't even tell you the last time I read it. And first of all, you're absolutely right. Michael Golden's artwork is stunning. And I always remembered that it was an important sort of resolution of that. But in addition to Carol's basically indictment that her mistake was in trusting the Avengers, she says something profound, which I'll quote back to you and to the audience. And Carol says to them very specifically, she says, there has to be more to being heroes than simply defeating villains. You have a role, a purpose far greater than yourselves. You have to set examples, lead the way. You represent what we should be, what we dream of becoming, not what we are. So, and she also says, hopefully you can learn with it. And you as a storyteller of these superpowered characters, how much more interesting is it for you when people that claim to be Earth's mightiest heroes or uncanny or amazing or whatever, they do actually hold themselves up to the kind of standard that Carol's talking about there?
Well, bear in mind that the line that defined, I guess, the Marvel ethic for me was, with great power comes great responsibility. Right. It's a cliche now because we've been listening to people say it and wank on it for a good long time. But it's a very, Stan epitomized the whole concept in what, 7 words?
Yeah.
With great power comes great responsibility. Yeah. The challenge is learning the definition of the word responsibility. How do we hold, what are the terms under which we hold ourselves accountable? What limits are we prepared to go to? Carol in the movie discovers that all the foundations of her life that she believed were of her life in the Kree were false, and the people she thought of were villains, the Skrulls, were just fugitives, refugees. They're trying to get to a better place just so they can live. She has to make a choice. The intriguing thing that came to my mind at the end of the film was, does she still have blue blood, or is she back to normal? Or, they pulled out all of her blood and replaced it with Kree blood. But I'm thinking, hang on, one would think that would have an interesting effect on the rest of her circulatory system.
Very true.
But that's far too up the technical advice. from my pay grade.
I think when the movie clocks into 2 hours and 5 minutes, you don't think like, hey, let's figure out how we explain her blood and all that. But it is a fascinating question, and I don't know.
Well,
I would like a firm answer on it. Sorry, what was that?
It might be explained down the road.
Yes, I would hope that there's a lot of things that, we get just like a few second glimpse of her father, and we don't, they don't deal with any of her family at all, basically. Sorry for interrupting. No problem.
The other thing one has to bear in mind looking at Captain Marvel is that the series was written in the 70s. So the attitude of her father to, Carol, why do I send, we only have enough money to send to help one kid go to college. I mean, and Carol actually starts out by saying, I've earned half of what I need to get in the door. I need the other half.
Right.
And bear in mind, in those days, we're talking like $3,000,
right.
60 grand.
Yeah.
And he says, why forgive, he doesn't even say forgive me. He says, Carol, you're a girl. Why would I spend money to send you to college when all you're going to do is meet some nice guy, get married, have babies, and live happily ever after? I'm going to send your brother to college because he'll make something of himself. And of course, the irony is her brother went to Vietnam and didn't come back. He's on the wall.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like but that was the attitude in those days. The guys went out and had the families, had the jobs, built the world, and the women stayed home and took care of everything else. Fast forward to 2018 when they were putting this together and filming it, the whole framework of society and characters and attitudes and responsibilities has changed beyond 100%. I mean, at this point in time, you have women flying active fighter roles off of carriers. You have women in command and control roles, both in all the armed services. The paradigm has changed, hopefully beyond correction, and the film has to reflect that. I mean, as the person who wrote those scenes, I could argue that I'm irked that none of that got included in the film. But from a social standpoint, from an analytic standpoint, this is where one has to step back and say, well, it's been 40 years. Times have changed. Right. And the film has to reflect that. I mean, I think they were taking enough of a risk going back to the mid-90s, because I was expecting to see like a news broadcast in the background talking about Apocalypse destroying half the world and the X-Men fighting for their life, fighting to stop it. But right. That's just me being a brat. No, I mean, that you just, I mean, I suppose my one dream, deep down in my heart of hearts, dream moment, wish fulfillment is, since I think next week is supposedly, knock wood, the final conclusion of the
Disney Fox merger, yeah.
The return of two wandering concepts to their original home. I kept waiting. You run the credits of Avengers, and you finally get to the end. They've done the final trailer of all the film companies that were in on this, and suddenly the screen goes black, and you start hearing a phone ring, and it keeps ringing and ringing and ringing. The camera opens up, and you see you're in a high rise. You're looking out the windows, and in the background is Boston, and the phone's in the center, and it's still ringing, and Carol walks into the scene and picks up the phone, and you hear Patrick Stewart going, "Carol?" And she looks at the phone and goes, "Charles?" And then she looks straight out at the camera and just grins. Right. And we go to black.
Yeah, that
would go up there with the Cap birthing up the
the Tesseract. Yeah. Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how they incorporate, you know, those properties back in. I'm still waiting for my great Fantastic Four movie that we haven't gotten just yet, but obviously having those characters and the X-Men back, you know, under the big tent, as it were, will be good. One final thing, I want to talk about a couple other things, but one final thing about Carol is, you know, you mentioned this reintroduction of her as binary, and that was really, you know, her sort of being her own character and different from all that. Unless I'm mistaken, you when you left Marvel in '91, she was still binary, and you would she'd occasionally still showed up, and so then everything happened was after the fact, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I find it intriguing that the Carol I wrote, the Ms. Marvel I wrote, she was strong and she was tough, but she didn't fly faster than light.
Right.
I mean, a lot of the visually exciting and dynamic powers that the cinematic Captain Marvel exemplifies, to my eye, prejudice that it is, clearly are derived from binary, which you know, that's their prerogative. It's Marvel stuff and a Marvel character, and it's definitely appropriate to Captain Marvel, or to Carol rather.
Sure.
So we'll see what happens next. It is totally cool, and I like the idea that they're billing her as the most significantly powerful character in the Marvel universe that we're aware of. I guess from my side of the desk, I'm curious to see what happens next. I mean, the question I posed on Facebook was, Galactus is going all through the galaxy, committing all manner of atrocities, wiping out half of everybody. Convenient that Carol is on the right side of the half and not the T'Challa side.
Right.
But it's like, how come nobody noticed? You know, I mean, you've got all these sort of cosmically aware characters, Carol being one of them. How come he was operating below their radar? You know, but that's again, when one is raised in Stan continuity, where where the company was small enough, the amount of books contained enough that you could literally keep all of the general story ideas in your head as you're writing your own stuff. It's now expanded exponentially, and you just have to keep your fingers crossed and, okay, they'll figure it out down the line, or either that or it will be a huge mutual discussion forum on Facebook or Twitter or whatever.
Right. Speaking of writing stories, one thing I wanted to talk about is that you have something coming up for Marvel in May, which will be a Nightcrawler story in Marvel Comics Presents, set during the epic Crosstime caper, which I enjoyed in the pages of Excalibur. What can you tell us about this story?
Well, oddly enough, at the very same time, the Berlin Wall was having problems, let us say. So this is Nightcrawler in Berlin, the day the wall fell. And you'd be amazed at what we can fit into 10 pages.
Yeah.
And actually, looking a little further down the road, I got to have the absolute delight of teaming up with Salvador La Roca again, for the first time, I guess, since pretty much since Extreme, on a 10-pager involving Kitty and Logan, which is sort of an add-on postscript, except it's mid-story, to the Kitty Wolverine miniseries. So we're in Japan, and it's a story involving Wolverine, which I like to think shows a side of Wolverine no one has ever seen before, if they've even imagined it. So that ought to be fun.
No, that'll definitely be fun. I was a huge fan of that series, the 6-issue Kitty Pryde and Wolverine series. Obviously, the Wolverine Frank Miller series everybody talks about, and not that it isn't, of course, great, but that was always just, I really liked that story. So the idea that it'll sort of revisit that, I'm excited. You know, the last time I talked to you, speaking of Kitty, you were very clear about the fact that you didn't like the idea of Kitty and Colossus getting married. Well, apparently, Kitty agreed with you. And do you feel like that's better for both of those characters, that they weren't sort of, you know, forced together, and then that kind of, I don't know, I guess future writers have to sort of deal with them now actually being married?
I think the problem with marriage in comic books is partly the passage of real time as opposed to comic book time, but mostly it's a commitment. It's a life commitment. And none of the marriages I've seen have worked other than Reed and Sue. I mean, to have Spider-Man cut a deal sort of with Mephisto.
Oh, yeah.
To have this marriage with
Mary Jane.
Mary Jane, to have Scott dump Madeline and his child to go back to Jean. To have Jean and the others accept that. It's like, come on. You guys are supposed to, again, you're supposed to stand for something. And, you know, this is not the way you want your heroes to act. It always never, I mean, the Pyms broke up. The problem is you get 5, 6, 8, 10 years down the line, you realize there are stories we can't do because the character's married.
Right.
And there are directions we can't go that you would expect out of a married couple, i.e. children, that are inappropriate in the active world. We take all the romantic drama and suspense out of a series, and for me it doesn't comfortably work. I mean, I gather now that Superman is married to Lois.
Yes.
I don't know where that's going to go. Batman failed to get married to Catwoman, but you know, it just cuts off options.
Yeah.
And I think if you notice, like in NCIS, Gibbs never has a lasting relationship. Even when he likes the lady and the lady likes him, it never goes anywhere because basically his commitment is to his dead wife and daughter. But it's the same paradigm in comics in any continued series. If you make a change like that, you can't take it back.
Right. And I think that's the reason why, as convoluted as that Mephisto storyline was, they were just like, Spider-Man works best, you know, if he's not a kid age anymore, if he's sort of, you know, unfettered in that way. So I understand that standpoint. We only have a few more minutes, so I wanted to just very quickly say that it was actually a lot of fun to see you turn up on an episode of The Gifted in the form of as someone who had a website and you knew all about the Morlocks. You were one of those conspiracy people. Have you seen much of that show, and what do you think of it?
I haven't seen much of that show, and so I really am not in a position to make any judgments. It's just it's hard to keep track of stuff that's on TV.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially when I'm working, and so I'm hoping at some point someone in the studio might send me a DVD set so I could actually watch it, but we'll see. The one thing I will say, going back to Carol for a minute, what I hope they won't forget in terms of presenting her on the screen is it being Azumi, being Air Force, and starting out in her case, I don't know if they do it in the film, but as enlisted, she plays a wicked game of poker. I mean, in my comic vision of her, she's as good as Nick Fury, and that's as good as it gets. And the best thing about playing poker is her and Nick going one-on-one and seeing who's going to win. So one of the things I always liked about Carol was she was a demon poker player, and I hope we see that in movie scenes to come.
Yes, it's something that I remember her referencing a lot. And, you know, finally, before we wrap up, I feel like I need to talk to you about Dark Phoenix, which I'll always say that that story to me is the best comic book story of all time, at least that I've read. And I want a film that does it justice. Are you able to enjoy a film like that? Or is it almost like Protective Services takes a child away and then you check in on it when it's like 15 years old to see how it's doing?
No, I thought Days of Future Past. I thought Days of Future Past was a hell of a lot of fun.
Yes.
I mean, for me, the only problem with Days of Future Past is what I would have done at the end is Logan comes over and there's Famke Janssen and there's Scott, and the next line is, oh, and this is our daughter Rachel, and that's where Sophie Turner comes out, and then you bring in Apocalypse as not 1980 something,
yeah,
but 2016 or 2017, and then you do Days of Future Past as 2020, and that's, as we hope people would notice by then, that's the Westchester incident that's referred to all the way through Old Man Logan, well,
right.
through Logan. But to me, it's when you're going to embrace a story, the challenge I've always faced with the way that Brian and the others approached post Days of Future Past films is, why do I want to watch a film that's set in 1980 or 1993? Because I saw the last scenes of Days of Future Past. I know everyone's alive in 2017.
Right.
So where's the suspense? But that's the challenge I assume Simon will embrace and make us all go, wow, he's really good when we see the finished product.
Yeah.
But that's in June.
Yes, well, I hope that I'll be able to chat with you after you've seen it, and I'm excited about this New Mutants movie if it ever happens, if it actually comes out. I love those characters, but so if for some reason this isn't the movie and they it gets short shrift because of the merger, I hope that we get a great New Mutant story at some point.
I think the challenge is a lot more primal than the merger. I think the challenge for Dark Phoenix is, will Avengers leave any money left in the world for people to go to the movies after that?
And I think that's definitely the problem. Well, Chris, I always appreciate you being so generous with your time. And people can, to get in touch with you and see what you're up to, appearances you might have, just go to chrisclaremont.com. And you mentioned a couple of things that are coming up. But this is always great fun. And we talked for an hour. I could have easily done another hour, but I won't subject you to that this time. I'll at least wait until Dark Phoenix comes out.
If I could interject for a brief, I'll be at C2E2 in Chicago this coming weekend and in St. Louis the weekend after. So if anyone in that neck of the woods does have questions, tell them, come on by. I love to answer.
That's right. Well, yeah, always good to answer a question and always great to have a chat. So thanks again, Chris Claremont. And as I said, you can find him at chrisclaremont.com. As for me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChristianDMZ. And as you probably know, I have my own personal podcast, The Bladtcast, BLADTCAST.com. And you can find some past interviews I've had with Chris there. That's all the time we have for today, but we'll be back at our regular time, Sunday night at 9 Pacific, here on AfterBuzz TV. Until then, as the great Stan Lee would say, Excelsior!
Our founder, Kevin Undergaro, and me, Maria Menounos, would like to thank you for tuning in to AfterBuzz TV. Remember, we're not just the first, we're the biggest in the world, and we're the only destination for all your favorite TV shows. Whatever you crave, we've got it. So go to AfterBuzzTV.com and check out our lineup. Buzz you later.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of AfterBuzz TV or its owners or principals.